Have you ever caught yourself in a moment of profound creation, writing something that seems to come from beyond you, solving a problem with unexpected insight, or experiencing a flash of compassion that transcends your normal boundaries, and wondered, what is this force moving through me? We've been conditioned to look upward for the sacred, to imagine divinity as something separate and above.
But what if the most profound spiritual truth isn't about finding God elsewhere, but recognizing the divine slowly awakening within human consciousness itself? For centuries, religious and political authorities have positioned the sacred as external to humanity, a transcendent power to be worshipped, obeyed, and feared. They've told us that divinity is perfect and complete, while humanity is fallen and flawed.
This separation has shaped civilizations, justified hierarchies, and molded our very sense of self. We've been taught to seek salvation through submission rather than through becoming. But Friedrich Nietzsche, that philosophical thunderbolt of the 19th century, glimpsed a different possibility, perhaps the most radical spiritual insight of modern times. Behind his famous proclamation that God is dead lay not merely a rejection of traditional religion, but the recognition of an astonishing possibility. What if divinity isn't a completed reality existing elsewhere, but an emergent process unfolding through human evolution? What if the universe is becoming conscious of itself through us? This isn't simply another philosophical abstraction. It represents a complete inversion of our spiritual inheritance, a perspective that could transform not just our understanding of religion, but our relationship with our own potential. The sacred is not found, Nietzsche revealed. It is created within man. Have you ever sensed, in your moments of greatest clarity or creativity, that something profound is trying to emerge through human consciousness, something that isn't yet complete, but is in the process of becoming? Consider a curious paradox at the heart of religious experience. Throughout history, humans have reported profound encounters with the divine, moments of transcendence, illumination, and connection to something greater than themselves. These experiences often share remarkable similarities across cultures and eras, suggesting something universal in human consciousness. Yet simultaneously, religious institutions have typically framed divinity as fundamentally separate from humanity, as a perfect, completed being entirely distinct from our flawed, limited existence. This creates a peculiar contradiction. The divine is both intimately accessible through direct experience and infinitely distant by theological definition. This contradiction becomes even more striking when we examine how religious authorities have responded to mystics, those who claim direct experience of the divine. From Meister Eckhart to Teresa of Avila to Mansur al-Hallaj, mystics who experienced union with the divine have often been viewed with suspicion by religious hierarchies. Why? Perhaps because mystical experience suggests a more immediate relationship with divinity than institutional religion can comfortably accommodate. Even more telling is how religious traditions describe their founders. Buddha's enlightenment, Jesus' divine recognition, Muhammad's revelations. These pivotal moments involve humans experiencing profound awakenings of consciousness. Yet, the religions built around these experiences typically frame them as unique, unrepeatable encounters with an external divinity, rather than as expressions of evolutionary potential within humanity itself. The anomaly becomes clear. Our deepest spiritual intuitions point toward direct experience of the divine within human consciousness, while our dominant religious frameworks insist on maintaining an unbridgeable separation between humanity and divinity. This separation serves institutional interests, establishing priests, scholars, and religious authorities as necessary intermediaries between humans and the sacred. Modern neuroscience adds another dimension to this anomaly. Studies of contemplative states reveal that mystical experiences correlate with distinctive brain activities, suggesting that the capacity for transcendent awareness is built into our neural architecture. Meanwhile, evolutionary biology indicates that consciousness itself continues to evolve, with human self-awareness representing not an endpoint but a stage in an ongoing process.
These observations raise provocative questions. What if divinity isn't a static reality to be discovered, but a dynamic potential being realized through evolving consciousness? What if the separation between human and divine is not an eternal truth, but a developmental stage humanity is being called to transcend? And most importantly, what powerful interests might be threatened by the recognition that the sacred is emerging within humanity, rather than ruling over it? Do you see how the insistence
on divinity's externality might serve systems of control, while the recognition of divinity's emergence within us might catalyze unprecedented human flourishing and autonomy? In January 1889, in Turin, Italy, Friedrich Nietzsche experienced his final mental breakdown. Witnessing a horse being whipped by its owner, he threw his arms around the animal's neck, sobbing uncontrollably. He then collapsed and never regained his philosophical lucidity. The man who had proclaimed "God is dead" spent his final 11 years in silent madness, cared for by his mother and sister. This poignant end to Nietzsche's conscious life provides a crucial lens for understanding his philosophical project. Born in 1844 in Prussia to a Lutheran pastor, young Friedrich was initially destined for the ministry himself. His father died when Friedrich was only 4 years old, leaving the boy to be raised in a household of women dominated by Christian piety. This biographical context is essential for understanding Nietzsche's spiritual journey. He wasn't an atheist dismissing religion from ignorance. He was intimately familiar with Christian theology and deeply concerned with the spiritual crisis of his era. The 19th century had brought unprecedented challenges to religious certainty. Darwin's evolutionary theory, historical criticism of biblical texts, rapid industrialization, and the rise of scientific materialism all contributed to what Nietzsche diagnosed as a profound cultural disorientation. What made Nietzsche uniquely positioned to perceive new spiritual possibilities was his combination of religious background, philological training, and personal suffering. His expertise in ancient Greek allowed him to recognize alternatives to the Judeo-Christian framework. His chronic illness, debilitating migraines, stomach ailments, and deteriorating vision placed him in constant dialogue with physical limitation and transcendence. Most significantly, Nietzsche lived during a pivotal moment in intellectual history. The death of traditional religion left a vacuum of meaning that neither scientific materialism nor secular rationalism could fill. As he wrote in The Gay Science, 1882, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent?" This wasn't triumphalist atheism, but a profound recognition of cultural crisis. Nietzsche saw that Western civilization had undermined its own foundations and now faced an unprecedented challenge, creating meaning without appealing to external authority. This challenge led him not to nihilism, as often misunderstood, but to a radical reimagining of humanity's spiritual potential. In the Swiss mountains near Sils Maria in 1881, Nietzsche experienced what he called the thought of thoughts, the concept of eternal recurrence that would form the heart of his mature philosophy. This wasn't merely an intellectual insight, but a visceral, transformative experience that he described as changing his entire perspective on existence. Through his personal spiritual journey from pious Christian to revolutionary philosopher, Nietzsche developed a unique capacity to see beyond the false dichotomy between religious dogmatism and materialist reductionism. He perceived a third possibility, that divinity itself might be evolving through human consciousness, rather than existing as a completed reality elsewhere. What experiences in your own life have led you to question whether the sacred might be something emerging through humanity, rather than simply ruling over it? Evidence for Nietzsche's revolutionary insight about divinity's emergence within humanity appears throughout his writings, but finds its most powerful expression in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, written between 1883 and 1885. This work, which Nietzsche considered his greatest, introduces the concept of the Übermensch, often misleadingly translated as Superman, but better understood as overhuman or beyond human. Contrary to popular misinterpretation, the Übermensch isn't about racial superiority or domination over others. It represents the possibility of humanity transcending its current limitations through a profound evolution of consciousness. In Zarathustra's first speech, he proclaims, "I teach you the overhuman. Human is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome it? This language of overcoming reflects Nietzsche's understanding of spiritual evolution as an active, creative process rather than passive submission to external authority. In the same text, he writes, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the overhuman, a rope over an abyss." This metaphor positions humanity not as a fallen creature seeking restoration to a prior perfection, but as a transitional stage in an ongoing evolutionary journey. Nietzsche's personal correspondence reveals how central this vision was to his philosophical project. In a letter to his friend Franz Overbeck in 1884, he wrote, "I have given mankind the profoundest book it possesses, my Zarathustra." He recognized that he was articulating something beyond conventional philosophy or religion, a new understanding of human potential that transcended both. Particularly significant is Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung, which appears repeatedly in his mature works. This isn't mere self-improvement, but a fundamental transformation of consciousness. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, "The spirit now wills its own will, and he who had been lost to the world now conquers his own world." This describes not just psychological development, but spiritual emergence, the birth of new capacities for meaning creation and self-determination. In The Antichrist, 1888, one of his final works, Nietzsche criticizes Christianity not primarily for its beliefs, but for its externalization of divinity. The Christian concept of God, God as God of the sick, God as a spider, God as spirit, is one of the most corrupt conceptions of the divine ever attained on earth. His objection isn't to divinity itself, but to its conceptualization as something separate from and opposed to human becoming. What makes this evidence particularly compelling is how it aligns with Nietzsche's own spiritual development. The philosopher who began as a pious Christian became not a simple atheist, but a prophet of humanity's spiritual potential. His journey wasn't away from the sacred, but toward a profound reimagining of what the sacred might become through human evolution. Most tellingly, in Ecce Homo, 1888, his intellectual autobiography, Nietzsche writes, "I do not set up any new idols. Overthrowing idols, my word for ideals, that comes closer to being part of my craft. This isn't mere iconoclasm, but the clearing of space for a new understanding of divinity, not as external idol, but as emerging reality within human consciousness itself." Have you noticed in your own experience how moments of greatest creativity, compassion, or insight often feel like participation in something greater than yourself? Not as submission to an external power, but as the emergence of new capacities within you. As we follow Nietzsche's investigation deeper, we discover that his understanding of divinity's emergence within humanity developed through specific stages, each revealing another aspect of this revolutionary spiritual insight. Tracing this development helps us understand both its philosophical foundations and its practical implications for human becoming. The first stage appears in Nietzsche's early work, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, where he explores the tension between the Apollonian and Dionysian principles in Greek culture. The Apollonian represents order, individuation, and rational clarity, while the Dionysian embodies ecstatic unity, creative chaos, and transcendence of individual boundaries. Crucially, Nietzsche doesn't position either principle as superior, but recognizes their necessary interplay in human creativity. This early insight foreshadows his mature understanding of divinity as an emergent process requiring both structure and transcendence. By the time he wrote Human All Too Human, 1878, Nietzsche had begun to diagnose how traditional religion externalizes qualities that properly belong to human potential. He observes, "There has never been a God other than human creations, projections of their needs, hopes, and wills." This isn't merely skepticism, but recognition that what humans have called divine reflects their own highest aspirations and deepest potentials projected outward. The investigation deepens in The Gay Science, 1882, where Nietzsche's famous proclamation that God is dead appears. The surrounding passage reveals that this isn't simply atheistic dismissal, but recognition of a profound cultural transformation. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? This striking question, must we not become gods, points directly to Nietzsche's emerging understanding of divinity as humanity's evolutionary horizon rather than its external creator. The death of God as external authority creates both crisis and opportunity, the possibility of divinity's rebirth within human consciousness itself. In his notebooks from 1883, collected in The Will to Power, Nietzsche writes, "Man is something to be surpassed. Zarathustra is the herald of this idea. This surpassing isn't physical evolution, but transformation of consciousness. Specifically, the capacity to create meaning rather than receiving it from external authorities." Perhaps most remarkably, Nietzsche's investigation led him to reinterpret Jesus of Nazareth not as divine in the traditional sense, but as someone who embodied the possibility of transformed human consciousness. In The Antichrist, he writes, "This bringer of glad tidings died as he lived, as he taught, not to redeem mankind, but to demonstrate how one ought to live." Nietzsche saw Jesus not as God incarnate, but as a human who manifested the divine potential within humanity. Through these stages, Nietzsche's investigation reveals a coherent alternative to both traditional theism and reductive atheism. The recognition that divinity might be understood not as a completed reality existing elsewhere, but as an emergent potential being realized through human evolution. This isn't hubris or self-deification, but recognition of humanity's role in the universe's ongoing creative process. The evidence suggests that Nietzsche wasn't abandoning the sacred but relocating it, not in distant heavens or metaphysical realms, but in the evolving consciousness of humanity itself. But why has this aspect of his philosophy been so consistently misunderstood or marginalized? Do you recognize in your own spiritual journey a movement from seeking the divine externally toward recognizing it as something emerging through your own consciousness and creativity? As we continue tracing Nietzsche's philosophical journey, a consistent pattern emerges across his mature works, one that reveals divinity not as a supernatural being separate from nature and humanity, but as an emergent reality arising through nature's evolution toward greater consciousness, particularly in human creativity and self-transcendence. This pattern becomes most visible when we examine Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, often misunderstood as mere domination over others. In his notebooks from 1888, he clarifies, "My idea is that every specific body strives to become master over all space and to extend its force, its will to power, and to thrust back all that resists its extension. This isn't about political control, but describes the fundamental creative impulse in all life, the drive toward greater complexity, capacity, and self-expression." Crucially, Nietzsche saw human consciousness as the most developed expression of this creative impulse. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of the strange and weaker, suppression, hardness, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and, at the least and mildest, exploitation." While this language may sound harsh, he's describing the process through which all life evolves, by transforming its environment and creating new forms. The pattern becomes clearer when we consider Nietzsche's perspective on human creativity. In The Gay Science, he proclaims, "We want to be the poets of our lives, first of all in the smallest, most everyday matters." This isn't merely aesthetic preference, but recognition that creating meaning is humanity's fundamental spiritual activity. Through conscious creativity, humans participate in the universe's self-organization in an unprecedented way. Particularly revealing is Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate or destiny. In Ecce Homo, he writes, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, but love it." This isn't passive acceptance, but active embrace of participation in the universe's becoming. The pattern of divinity's emergence through human consciousness appears again in Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence, his thought of thoughts, experienced in Sils Maria. This isn't merely a cosmological theory about time's cyclical nature, but a spiritual test Could you affirm your life so completely that you would will its eternal return? Those capable of such affirmation manifest a new kind of consciousness, one that doesn't need external validation, but creates its own meaning. Perhaps most striking is how Nietzsche reimagined traditional religious concepts in evolutionary terms. Redemption becomes not salvation from sin, but liberation from limiting perspectives. Faith becomes not belief without evidence, but trust in life's creative potential. Spirit becomes not supernatural essence, but the highest expression of natural processes. What emerges clearly across Nietzsche's works is a consistent pattern. The sacred isn't something separate from nature and humanity, but something emerging through nature's evolution toward greater consciousness, particularly in human creativity and self-transcendence. This pattern suggests that divinity might be understood not as creator, but as creation's leading edge, the universe becoming conscious of itself through us. This perspective has profound implications. If the divine is emerging through human consciousness rather than ruling over it, then our highest calling isn't submission to external authority, but participation in this emergence through creative meaning-making, compassionate action, and continuous self-overcoming. Spiritual practice becomes not worship of the completed, but midwifery of the becoming. Have you noticed how your own most profound spiritual experiences often involve not submission to something external, but the emergence of new capacities within your own consciousness, whether creativity, compassion, insight, or love? The implications of Nietzsche's insight about divinity's emergence within human consciousness extend far beyond abstract philosophy. They challenge us to fundamentally reconsider not only our religious concepts, but our understanding of consciousness, ethics, meaning, and humanity's place in cosmic evolution. First, this perspective transforms our understanding of consciousness itself. Rather than seeing awareness as either a purely biological function or a gift from a supernatural creator, Nietzsche suggests it might be understood as the universe's evolutionary frontier, matter organizing itself into increasingly complex forms capable of self-reflection. Human consciousness, in this view, isn't separate from nature, but nature's leading edge of development. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "Once you were apes, and even now too, man is more ape than any ape." This isn't mere provocation, but recognition that humanity represents a transitional stage rather than an evolutionary endpoint. If consciousness continues to evolve, our current awareness may be to future possibilities what animal consciousness was to early humans, a foundation rather than a culmination. This insight also revolutionizes our understanding of meaning and purpose. In traditional theology, meaning is imposed from outside by divine decree. In secular materialism, meaning is merely subjective projection onto an indifferent universe. Nietzsche proposes a third alternative. Meaning is neither discovered nor invented, but created through conscious participation in the universe's becoming. As he writes in The Gay Science, what was at stake in all philosophizing up to now was not at all truth, but something else. Let us say health, future, growth, power, life. Perhaps most profoundly, this perspective transforms ethics. If divinity is emerging through human consciousness rather than commanding from above, then moral development isn't about conformity to external rules, but evolution toward greater internal integration, compassion, and creative capacity. Nietzsche's concept of master morality isn't about dominating others, but mastering oneself, developing the internal coherence and creative power that characterize evolving consciousness. This understanding also reconfigures our relationship with suffering. Rather than seeing pain as punishment for sin or meaningless biological accident, Nietzsche recognizes its potential role in consciousness evolution, the discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you not know that it is this discipline alone that has created all enhancements of man so far? This isn't glorification of suffering, but recognition of its transformative potential when consciously integrated. For religious traditions, these implications are revolutionary. They suggest that authentic spirituality might focus less on worshipping divinity elsewhere and more on manifesting divine qualities through human development. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, the kingdom of God is not something one waits for. It has no yesterday or tomorrow. It does not come in 1,000 years. It is an experience of the heart. It is everywhere. It is nowhere. This reframes spiritual practice, not as preparation for future salvation, but as present participation in consciousness evolution. For secular humanism, these implications are equally challenging. They suggest that human potential extends beyond rational problem-solving toward forms of consciousness we can barely imagine, not through supernatural intervention, but through natural evolution. Nietzsche saw that materialism, no less than religious dogmatism, can limit our recognition of what consciousness might become. Perhaps most importantly, this perspective suggests that humanity bears a profound responsibility for cosmic evolution. If consciousness represents the universe's way of becoming aware of itself, then human choices and development may have significance beyond our individual lives, or even our species. We become, in a sense, the universe's organ of self-reflection and conscious direction. Have you considered how this understanding of divinity as emerging through human consciousness might transform not only religious concepts, but our entire relationship with evolution, meaning, and our place in the cosmos? The marginalization of Nietzsche's spiritual insights reveals a pattern of suppression that extends far beyond one philosopher's work. This suppression operates through interlocking religious, political, economic, and intellectual mechanisms that collectively maintain what we might call the externality doctrine, the insistence that divinity must remain separate from and superior to humanity rather than emerging through human consciousness. Religiously, institutional Christianity has consistently emphasized humanity's fallenness and need for external salvation, positioning divinity as categorically separate from human nature. While mystical traditions within Christianity have sometimes recognized divine presence within human consciousness, these perspectives have typically been marginalized or carefully contained by church authorities. When Meister Eckhart proclaimed, "God and I are one," he faced charges of heresy. When the Quakers insisted on direct inner experience of the divine without priestly mediation, they faced persecution. Nietzsche identified this pattern in The Antichrist, noting, "The priest is the castrator of man." Wherever the religious neurosis has appeared on earth, we find it tied to three dangerous dietary demands: solitude, fasting, and sexual abstinence. These practices, he suggests, aren't merely spiritual disciplines, but techniques for suppressing the full emergence of human potential, keeping divinity safely external, rather than recognizing its emergence within humanity itself. Politically, the externality doctrine serves power structures by positioning authority as deriving from above rather than emerging from within. Divine right monarchy, papal infallibility, and even secular political systems claiming to implement universal ideals all depend on this framework of transcendent authority descending to humanity rather than emerging through it. Nietzsche saw how the will to power operates in these structures not as conscious creativity, but as domination justified by appeals to external authority. In his notebooks from 1887, Nietzsche observes, "Morality is the doctrine of the relations of supremacy under which the phenomenon of life comes to be." This isn't moral relativism, but recognition that ethical systems often function to maintain existing power relations by presenting them as divinely ordained, rather than humanly constructed. Economically, consumer capitalism depends on maintaining a sense of lack or incompleteness that can supposedly be filled through acquisition. The recognition that fullness of being emerges through consciousness evolution rather than material accumulation threatens this economic engine. Nietzsche's concept of abundance through internal development rather than external acquisition represents a profound challenge to consumer society. Even academically, Nietzsche's spiritual insights have been systematically marginalized. His work has typically been interpreted through either religious critique, focusing on his challenges to Christianity, or postmodern philosophy, emphasizing his deconstruction of absolute truth claims. His positive spiritual vision of divinity's emergence through human consciousness has received far less attention, creating a distorted impression of his philosophy as merely negative or critical. Most subtly, the externality doctrine operates psychologically through what Nietzsche called ressentiment, the tendency to devalue what we cannot attain and elevate what we can claim. By positioning divinity as fundamentally separate from humanity, religious systems create both unattainable ideals and the psychological compensation of identifying with those ideals through submission rather than manifestation. This multi-layered suppression isn't coordinated conspiracy, but emergent pattern, the natural resistance of systems built on external authority when confronted with the possibility that the sacred might be emerging within humanity itself.
Nietzsche anticipated this resistance, writing in Beyond Good and Evil, "The most spiritual men, as the strongest, find their happiness where others would find their destruction. In the labyrinth, in hardness towards themselves and others, in experiment, their joy is self-conquest. Asceticism becomes in them nature, need, and instinct." Have you noticed how often spiritual traditions, even while speaking of divine presence, maintain rigid boundaries between human and divine nature, and how these boundaries often serve institutional interests rather than spiritual development? The systematic obscuring of Nietzsche's insights about divinity's emergence through human consciousness reveals deeper patterns in how power operates through control of spiritual narratives. This concealment doesn't require conscious conspiracy, but emerges naturally from structures dependent on maintaining separation between human and divine nature. First, Nietzsche's spiritual vision was deliberately misrepresented after his mental collapse in 1889. His sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who gained control of his literary estate, selectively edited his works to align with her own nationalist and anti-Semitic views. This political appropriation created lasting associations that obscured his actual philosophy, particularly his vision of consciousness evolution transcending national, racial, and religious boundaries. As Walter Kaufmann, the renowned Nietzsche scholar, observed, "Nietzsche's name has been coupled with Hitler's in the minds of many who have never read a word of his. But Nietzsche's works contain passages that constitute the most sustained attack upon anti-Semitism and nationalism that any European thinker had ever made." This misrepresentation served specific political agendas by obscuring Nietzsche's challenge to the very tribalism such agendas depended upon. Institutionally, Nietzsche's vision threatened established religious authorities by relocating the sacred within evolving human consciousness, rather than external institutions. Traditional religion has maintained its relevance largely by positioning itself as necessary intermediary between humanity and divinity. By suggesting that the divine might be directly accessed through consciousness evolution, Nietzsche threatened this mediating function. In The Antichrist, he writes, "The Christian concept of God, God as God of the sick, God as a spider, God as spirit, is one of the most corrupt conceptions of the divine ever attained on earth." What made this critique particularly threatening wasn't atheism, but the suggestion of an alternative spirituality based on internal development rather than external worship. Academically, Nietzsche's spiritual insights have been marginalized through selective interpretation. Secular scholars often emphasize his critiques of religion while downplaying his positive spiritual vision. Religious scholars typically focus on defending against his challenges, rather than engaging his alternative understanding of divinity's relationship with humanity. This creates a distorted impression of his philosophy as primarily negative or deconstructive. Psychologically, Nietzsche's vision challenges what he called the spirit of gravity, the heavy seriousness that resists life's creative becoming in favor of fixed certainties. This resistance isn't merely intellectual but emotional and embodied. As he writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "And when I saw my devil, I found him serious, thorough, profound, solemn. He was the spirit of gravity. Through him all things fall." The externality doctrine provides psychological security through fixed metaphysical frameworks that Nietzsche's fluid, evolutionary understanding disrupts. Most importantly, Nietzsche's vision of divinity emerging through human consciousness threatens fundamental power structures by suggesting that authority emerges from within rather than descending from above. This challenges not only religious hierarchies, but political and economic systems dependent on external authority. If divinity represents not completed perfection elsewhere, but evolutionary potential within, then claims to represent divine authority become questionable. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche observes, "Wherever the religious neurosis has appeared on earth so far, we find it connected with three dangerous dietary prescriptions: solitude,
fasting, and sexual abstinence. These aren't merely spiritual practices, but techniques for maintaining separation between ordinary human experience and divine potential, keeping the sacred safely external rather than recognizing its emergence within humanity itself. Perhaps most ironically, Nietzsche himself became subject to the very externality he challenged. After his death, he was often positioned as a prophet-like figure, his words treated as authoritative pronouncements rather than provocations toward consciousness evolution. This transforms his challenge to external authority into yet another external authority, precisely the pattern his philosophy sought to disrupt. Have you noticed how spiritual insights that locate divinity within evolving human consciousness are consistently marginalized in favor of frameworks that maintain separation between human and divine nature, regardless of whether those frameworks are traditionally religious or ostensibly secular? What if the most profound spiritual revolution isn't finding God elsewhere, but recognizing divinity awakening within human consciousness itself? What if evolution isn't merely biological adaptation, but the universe's journey toward greater awareness, with humanity as its current frontier? What if the sacred isn't completed, but emerging, not commanding from above, but rising from within? Nietzsche's ultimate revelation wasn't the death of God, but the birth of divinity through human becoming. God is dead, he famously proclaimed, not as atheistic triumph, but as recognition of a profound spiritual transition. The fixed, external deity of traditional religion was giving way to something more dynamic, the emergence of divine qualities through evolving human consciousness. This perspective doesn't diminish the sacred, but relocates and revitalizes it. As Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "I love those who do not first seek beyond the stars for reasons to go under and to be sacrifices, but who sacrifice themselves for the earth, that the earth may someday belong to the overhuman." This isn't rejection of transcendence, but its integration with immanence, divinity emerging through nature rather than standing outside it. The practical implications of this revelation are profound. If divine qualities emerge through human evolution rather than descending from above, then spiritual practice becomes not worship of the completed, but cultivation of the becoming. Meditation, contemplation, creative expression, compassionate action. These become not means of connecting with something external, but ways of manifesting emerging potentials within consciousness itself. This understanding transforms our relationship with meaning. Rather than receiving purpose from external authority or resigning ourselves to cosmic meaninglessness, we recognize our participation in meaning's creation. As Nietzsche put it, he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. This why isn't given from above, but emerges through conscious participation in life's creative becoming. Perhaps most importantly, this perspective offers integration where traditional frameworks create division. It transcends the false dichotomy between religious dogmatism and secular materialism, suggesting a third possibility, that consciousness itself represents nature's evolutionary frontier, with humanity as its current, but not final, expression. This isn't human exceptionalism, but recognition of our place in an ongoing cosmic process. This understanding doesn't require belief in the supernatural, but appreciation of what Thomas Nagel calls natural teleology, the possibility that consciousness evolution may be inherent to the universe rather than accidental. It suggests that meaning, value, and purpose might be neither human projections nor divine commands, but emergent properties of the cosmos itself becoming conscious. If this perspective resonates with something you've intuited beneath traditional spiritual frameworks, you're not alone. Throughout history, there have been those who glimpsed this possibility, from ancient Gnostics who sought the kingdom within, to romantic poets who saw nature's divine animation, to contemporary evolutionary mystics who recognize consciousness as the universe's creative edge. I invite you to join our philosophical investigation by leaving a comment about a moment when you've experienced divinity not as something external, but as a quality emerging through your own consciousness, perhaps in creativity, compassion, insight, or love. Share this perspective with others, seeking integration beyond the false choice between religious dogmatism and materialist reduction. and subscribe to continue exploring the hidden wisdom that can liberate human potential. The final question isn't whether God exists elsewhere, but whether divinity is emerging through human consciousness itself, whether the universe is becoming aware of itself through us, and whether we can consciously participate in this emergence. As Nietzsche wrote, "The sacred is not found, it is created within man." And if we truly embrace this understanding, how might we live differently? With what care might we cultivate the evolutionary potentials within our own consciousness? With what reverence might we approach others as fellow participants in divinity's emergence? As fellow investigators of life's deepest mysteries, let's continue this exploration together. Like this video if you've glimpsed this truth in your own experience. Comment with a moment when you've sensed divine qualities emerging through your own consciousness rather than descending from above. And subscribe to join our community of philosophical explorers, challenging narratives that separate us from our deepest potentials. Remember, the divine isn't waiting in heaven, it's rising inside you.